It's time to stitch the topiary house on the Hometown Quilt. The topiary house is on page 22. I have the background fabric and the grass fabric that make up the background fabric of the block, and I have the batting, and I have pulled all of the fabric that will be used in this block. And as a reminder, I am doing mine a little bit different. I have all of the fabric that I have cut for all of the house blocks, and I have labeled and put them in packets. I have 2 packets that have the house block fabrics, and the only difference between these 2 packets is one is the single letter fabrics and one is the double letter fabrics, just so it's easy for me to pull what fabrics I need. Then I have a packet that has the background and the grass fabrics all together. The way that I am finding out what I need for the house blocks is I will turn to the house that I'm working on, and in the directions, it lists the letter of the fabric. So for example, when I start the block, it's going to be fabric C, which is the background, and the grass fabric, and in this case, it is fabric V. And then I'll just look at the next fabric that they list, which is L. So I would go to my packet. I found my L fabric, and again, mine have not been cut to size, and so you can see that I use this on the first house, and so I will just use this as needed, and it goes back into the packet. So then I would come to the next one. I will find the CC fabric, and I will just go through the entire directions for this block. I will pull the F fabric, Y fabric, the G fabric, and I will continue through all of the directions, and you can see that all of these fabrics are the fabrics I need for this topiary house. And I do want to note, I'm not sure I mentioned this, but the grass fabric that I have separate with just the grass and the background, we use these fabrics in other places, not just the grass. And so I have 2 pieces. So for example, K is a grass fabric, but K is also used in the house portion of the block, not just the grass. I have this piece of fabric that will be used towards the house block, and then these are for the grass. So I hope that makes sense. So K, Q is another one that is a grass fabric. H is a grass fabric, and there is one more, this V, and that might not be used in this block, but it's in here. So I hope that makes sense. I've kept the background fabrics and grass fabrics together so they're easy to find. All of my fabrics have been backed with fusible interfacing. And again, I have my batting for the blocks cut exactly to size, which is 7 by 7. So let's get started on the topiary house. I'm going to come to embroidery and to my USB and to the combined files house folder and select house 2, which is the topiary house. I'll hit set and embroidery. Now I do need to change my hoop size, so I'm going to come up to the settings, and I am using my 9.5 by 9.5. I will select OK, and I am just going to leave that centered. I am not keeping my stabilizer on the roll like I normally do. I am using no show mesh and cutting it just to size, since we take this hoop in and out so much because there's so much applique. So I am going to go to this minus plus needle. I just like to go to this in case I need to go back or forward stitches or steps. So the first step is going to be the placement for the batting. And if you have not watched my Embrilliance software video, that shows how I add background quilting. This is not in the directions. This is something that I chose to do on my own, and it's different again than the directions. And so I am going to first run the batting placement. Again, I have my batting cut exactly to size. So I have the back of my batting lightly sprayed with adhesive, and I am going to place it right in the placement lines. I am using the thread that I will be using for the grass, and that is the first color that will be seen, and so I am just going to use that. And again, my batting is cut exactly to size, and so it's ready to go to the next step, which is the placement line for our background fabric. With this background fabric, the first piece is the sky fabric, and that is going to be placed right side up, and I'm just going to line it up right along with that placement line and just center it. The fabric is just a little bit smaller than that placement line, and so as long as I have about equal amounts of fabric past the batting, I'll be good. And so that's right aligned right along there. Now I'm going to take the grass fabric right side down, and I'm just going to line it up with the sky fabric right along that placement line. And now it's going to do the tack down. So after tacking both fabrics together, I am going to flip this grass fabric over. I'm going to finger press, and then I have a little iron that I am going to just press that so I can get it as flat as I can. I just have a pressing mat or a wool mat right in front of my machine. And I want that as flat as possible. And now it's time to do the tack down. Now the tack down, I am using that same dark green, and that is going to help at the end when I'm trimming this block to size. That will help me center my fabric when I use my ruler to cut this block to size. Now I'm going to do the background quilting for the grass. And again, this is something that is not in the directions. I added the quilting. Now I'm going to do the background quilting of the sky. Now that the background quilting is done, we are going to start on the house, and this is mostly applique, and so all of these elements will be done basically the same. I will run the placement stitch, I'll place my fabric, and again, I have not cut my fabrics to the size of the applique. I will just place my whole piece of fabric, tack it down, and trim around it. So let's get started. We're going to start with the house. With the house, you might be able to see the placement. And so here's my piece of fabric that I used on the first block. And to use this side down here, it wouldn't be quite as big. The fabric's not as big enough because it leaves a corner out. So I will just flip this fabric around and I will line up this over and make sure that all of the placement lines are covered. And then I'll tack it down. After the satin stitch of the house, I ran the roof placement line, and I'm going to place my fabric and stitch it down. Now I'm not sure that this is going to be used somewhere else. It's quite long, so I am going to put it more towards a corner, just making sure I have enough to tack down. And I will have, a couple of inches, and that might be because that goes to another piece of a house somewhere down the road. But I also want to note that once this is tacked down, it's going to not do the satin stitching of the roof quite yet. And so sometimes you'll tack something down, trim it, and move to a different step before doing the final stitching. So you just have to watch the directions and make sure you're putting in the right color thread. All right, so let's tack this down and trim it, and we'll move on. The next 3 pieces for the door, which is right here, the placement, and then the 2 little chimneys, there's a couple ways that I can do this since I don't cut my fabric to the size. So I could either do these separate. I use this on the first beehive house, and so I could take the sections and, for example, place this one over, tack it down, and just manually stop my machine, trim, and then move this little piece over to this chimney, and then come over and do the door this way. That was my first thought. The second is I could probably put this it would do both chimneys, and then I would manually stop it, trim it, and then use this piece for the door. So I think I'm going to do that, so I only have to stop it once versus the 2 times for 3 separate pieces. So I hope that makes sense. Again, the directions I think call for a big, huge piece that would be one whole piece that fits both the door and the 2 chimneys, and I just think that's a lot of waste. So this is how I've chosen to do it. However, if you've cut according to the directions, you will have one large piece, and you'll just let all 3 tack downs run. The next step is going to do, before putting the satin outlining around the chimney and the doors, is going to do a little fence embroidery. placement for the windows were just stitched, and now I'm going to take my window fabric and place it over. Again, if you're going according to the directions, you will have a big large square. I am going to place this over, and I am going to go ahead and tape this since there were so many of those little windows. I don't want this to really shift. And so I will just tape to hold this while it stitches the tack down. The last thing for this block is the topiary trees. Now there are 3 little balls for each of the topiaries, and I have 3 fabrics. So the top, smaller, will be one fabric, the middle will be another fabric, and the bottom will be a different fabric. Now it will do, of course, both tops, both middles and both bottoms together. And so once I get the placement, I could put this whole piece of fabric like that and do the 2 little balls, but then, you know, I'm wasting this if this isn't going to fit something else, which that's a pretty big space. It probably would be okay, but I am going to do the same thing on these little topiaries that I did with the chimney and the door. Once it tacks down the first, I'm going to manually stop my machine, just lightly or loosely trim away the fabric, move it over, and finish the second one. Then I'll do the same with the second. I'll tack the first piece down, manually stop my machine, trim the fabric, move it to the second. Again, that's something that I'm choosing to do. It's not in the directions. They have much larger pieces, but I'm trying to conserve, and I'll be able to use my scraps. All right, so let's finish up this block. Here is the topiary house done, and I love it. If you'll notice the topiary trees, parts of the chimney, the roof, this little roof, the pots, even the windows all have a decorative textured satin outlining. I love it. So what I'm going to do now is trim it to size. Again, I am using Lori Holt's ruler that's made specifically for this smaller block. And if you're using a regular ruler, you would just need to make sure that you cut this 7.5 by 7.5 and line up this seam 1 3/4 inches to the bottom cut line. And I go over more of that in detail in a previous video. So what I'm going to do, the directions say if you're using Lori Holt's ruler to line up the 1.5 inch, which again is 1 3/4, because then there is a 1/4 inch seam allowance, this teal border. And so I'm going to line that right up on the seam line between the sky and the grass. And that's the first thing that I want to line up. Now, because I used a darker thread, which I think is much easier than my first block when I used the light color thread, and I'm going to show you why. So if I line up the 1.5 inches, and I'm going to use the side tack down as kind of a guide to make sure that I'm in the center. Now, in a perfect world, my 7.5 inch tack down that I made would be exactly 7.5 inches. However, because that was done before all of the embroidery and the background quilting, that's probably not going to happen. And I think if you look, just looking, for example, at this edge, you can see that right in here, it kind of curves in, dips in, and that's just, I think, because there's so much embroidery and so much quilting. And the same thing with this side, you can see that it kind of just has a slight curve. And so when I line my ruler up to the 1.5 inches, and I'm going to line up the right side right with the top and the bottom of that tack down. And I'm going to show you two things. So in a perfect world, the tack down would be out here, and I'm not sure if you can see it. But because I used a dark thread, I can see that that tack down is right in the middle of this border seam allowance. So it has shrunk in just a little bit. So now what I need to do is kind of center that tack down line so that a little bit on this side will be in and a little bit on this side will be in to keep my block as even as I can. Same with the top and the bottom. Now it's more critical that my 1.5 inch mark is on the seam, and I'm not sure if you can see, but so my ruler is lined up where it needs to be. And if I look down here, it is right even with that tack down line. And again, in a perfect world, the top tack down line would be at the top of the ruler. And I'm not sure again if you can see, but this tack down line comes below the outside of the ruler. Now again, because I'm using her ruler, I'm going to leave it like that. I'm not going to split the difference between the top and the bottom because I need this seam at 1.5 inches on her ruler. I hope that's making sense. I'm using that tack down as just kind of a guide, centering, keeping in mind that the most important is the seam allowance, or is the lining up of this seam between the sky and the grass. I hope that I didn't totally confuse you and that you're still with me. So now I'm just going to trim right along this ruler. So I've trimmed my block to size, and I want to note a few things. If you'll look on the right side, you'll see a little bit of this tacked down, and you'll see a little bit on this side. There would be some up here, except for you might have noticed that my ruler kind of slipped when I was cutting, and so it kind of cut in a little bit farther. And so otherwise these sides would be the same, and that's what I mean by splitting the difference and making sure that it's, you know, the same amount is on each side. And it does look like this is crooked, but when I line my ruler up along the seam line, which again is the most important, it is even. So even though that looks like it might be crooked, my block is actually square. And so what I'm going to do, just as a note, is if I line this up on the back, you can see where my ruler slipped and I kind of gouged it. And so the top, and then of course everything from here down, is where when I'm sewing this to the block next to it, and this will just dip in a little bit as I sew my 1/4 inch seam, but it won't affect anything, and I will line up, you know, the top and the rest of the block. I hope that makes sense. And so luckily it you know, didn't go farther, and that might have affected the seam, but it was just a tiny bit before I caught it. I love the block, and so what I'm going to do is put this with my first. So here's my first 2 blocks. I love them. I can't wait. And these, I think, will have sashing between them. I'm pretty sure. And I don't need to worry also about taking, of course, this dark thread out, because it'll be in a seam allowance. So from the blocks that I have from now on, we'll have, I'm sure, some of that dark thread showing. I love them. So I'm just going to keep these 2 and the rest of them in here to protect them and keep them clean and lost. So let's get ready to do the sashing for the next 2 sashing blocks.